Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here with another TCG Tuesday. Some time ago, I did a quick deck tech about Chatterfang, the Squirrel General, and a deck that I was in the process of building. And I have since, even though it's been quite some time since that episode, I have since finished that deck and I would like to go over it now that I have the cards in hand. I will also be providing a deck list for this. So let's jump in. Some really quick things about this Chatterfang deck. Let me just bring this guy on camera. All right. Got ourselves Chatterfang here. This is a deck that I want to kind of look like a deck that is going to create a bunch of squirrel tokens and then swing wide. There is still that kind of backup plan in this deck, but I also kind of wanted to build this as a almost aristocrats type of deck. So what I want to see happen is one of many sack outlets to come into play and me to start sacrificing these tokens to generate some sort of value, either card draw, scry, whatever it is. And then I want to utilize triggers from things like Blood Artist or Zulaport Cutthroat to slowly but surely ping my opponents to death. And like I said, there's backups to this as well. I wanted, like I said, to make it look like a deck that wants to swing wide and then to just kind of pull the rug out from under them. So let's look at the general Chatterfang Squirrel General. I said general, I meant commander. Legendary creature Squirrel Warrior. We're going to run lots of squirrels in here, obviously. If one or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus that many 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens are created instead. So this first ability is kind of like a Parallel Lives ability, except that it's going to create a bunch of extra squirrels. So if I create, using something like Deranged Hermit, 4 squirrel tokens, if I have Chatterfang in play, I'm actually creating 8 squirrel tokens. And then the final part of his ability is I can pay a black, sacrifice X squirrels, and target creature gets plus X minus X until end of turn. So there's a good sack outlet right there. Not only am I possibly getting rid of something big and problematic on the field, I'm also getting that sack trigger. So if I have any of my cards like Blood Artist or Zulaport Cutthroat in play, we're not just losing the squirrels, we're also dealing some damage and taking out a big threat. Very cool card. This is the commander, so we're going to move into the creatures that we have available. Let me just see if I can separate those real quick. There we go. Pull this off to the side. As I mentioned before, we are running Deranged Hermit. Deranged Hermit is a expensive card. If you do end up, not being able to get a hold of one of these, because I think they're between $40 and $50 right now. It is a reserve list card. It is, it's never been reprinted, but it is extremely good. But again, if you're looking at the budget version, there's a lot of cards you can use to replace this, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Deranged Hermit has a CMC of 5, 3 and 2 green. It has Echo, which means during the next upkeep you have to pay that 3 and 2 green again, otherwise you lose the creature. You only ever have to pay Echo once. When Deranged Hermit comes into play, put 4 squirrel tokens into play, treat those tokens as 1/1 green creatures, and all squirrels get +1/+1. So he generates squirrels, and he also is a anthem for squirrels, and so you can't go wrong there. It does scream that we're trying to create huge amounts of squirrels and swing wide, so it really helps with the idea. I'm hoping that my opponents focus on that. Next up, we're going to have Squirrel Mob. Squirrel Mob is a 1 and 2 green creature squirrel. It gets +1/+1 for each other squirrel in play, so it just gets massive when there are more squirrels in play. It can become a huge threat. It's something that your opponents are going to want to deal with early on. So it's going to suck up those single target removals. Next up, we have Krosan Beast. Corrosive Beast is a 4/3 and a green creature Squirrel Beast. If you have threshold, so if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it gets +7/+7. So it goes from a 1/1 to an 8/8. And it's just like I said, it's a big beater on the table. You want to deal with it. It doesn't have trample, so it's not totally scary, but it's a big body, so you want to deal with that ASAP. Then we have Liege of Hollows. If you watched my kanji video, I feel about Liege of Hollows the same way I feel about Dovescape, in a sense. Yes, your opponents can benefit from Liege of the Hollows. However, they aren't going to benefit from it in the same way that you are. You are going to have the anthems up to help buff your creatures. You are also specifically trying to create a lot of these squirrels just so you can sack them for value. So you're giving them chump blockers, but at the same time, again, we're not trying to swing wide here. We are literally trying to attrition your opponent to death. So Liege of the Hollows is very interesting. If it dies, each player may pay any amount of mana to put that number of squirrel tokens into play under their control. So this could be really great as a suicidal blocker or a target or even part of your sack strategy, because you can sacrifice it, then tap a whole bunch of mana to create a whole bunch of squirrels, so on and so forth. More importantly, if you do use it as sack fodder, and you can specifically wait for your opponents to be tapped out or nearly tapped out to take advantage of that, so that they can't really use the ability if that's what you want to do. But again, it's not as bad for them to have squirrels as it is for you. We've got Squirrel Sovereign. Other squirrels you control get +1/+1. It costs 1 and a green, 2/2. It's Squirrel Anthem, and again, it just promotes this idea that we're trying to swing wide, and it gives you that backup plan to do so. Then we have Squirrel Wrangler as a druid. If you tap 1 and a green and sacrifice land, you can put 2 squirrels onto the battlefield. You can also tap 1 and a green and sacrifice land to give all squirrels +1/+1. So this is kind of a backup plan. When we get late game, if I still haven't been able to shut out the game, but we're in a place where life totals are pretty low, I could potentially just start sacking a whole bunch of lands and giving my squirrels +1/+1 and try to do the swing wide strategy. So we're still keeping our avenue open for the idea of swinging wide, but that isn't the main purpose of the deck. Next up, we have Toski, Bearer of Secrets. Can't be countered. It's indestructible. It attacks. It's aggressive. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So really what we're looking at here is this bottom ability that allows you to draw cards as creatures deal combat damage, so that we can keep the options going in our hands. Next up, we have Scurrid Colony. 1 and a green, 2/2 with reach. It gets +2/+2 as long as you control 8 or more lands. So it can be a potential 4/4 with reach. It's a good way to deal with flyers. It's a squirrel. That's about it. Next up, we have Scurry Oak. Now, Scurry Oak has a lot of applications in this deck. It is a tree folk for 2 and a green that has evolved. So whenever a creature enters the battlefield under my control, if it has either a greater power or greater toughness than this creature, you're going to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So we're getting +1/+1 counters on Scurry Oak. Whenever a one or more +1/+1 counters is put onto Scurry Oak, you get to create a green squirrel token, right? So this really helps with cards like Ivy Lane, I think, yeah, Ivy Lane Denizen, because you could potentially, when you play your first green creature for the turn, put a +1/+1 counter on that, and then pop a squirrel out. And then when you pop the squirrel out, another +1/+1 counter is going to be played. So you can continuously, I don't know if you can continuously loop it so that this guy gets like super huge because it says 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on it. Actually, that's an interesting idea. I don't know if that loops, but if it does loop, this guy can potentially get very large. And he's going to continuously put out what I imagine to be an infinite loop of squirrels, and I didn't realize that could be the case. Not 100% sure about that. Hit me up in the comments below if that's actually something that happens, but I'll also look at the Oracle text on that as well. Next up, we have Ravenous Squirrel. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact or creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Ravenous Squirrel. It also has tap 1, a black and a green, sacrifice an artifact or creature, you gain a life and draw a card. So this is a potential sack outlet that gets really out of hand. Not only are you going to get value because you're going to gain life and draw a card from sacrificing a creature, but that's the whole point of this, is that we're going to sacrifice our squirrel tokens to get value off of them, trigger the aristocrat abilities, and in this case also get +1/+1 counters on the Ravenous Squirrel to make him outright obnoxious. Then we have Nut Collector for 5 and a green. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a squirrel creature token into play, and then if you have thresholds, 7 or more cards in your graveyard, all squirrels get +2/+2. So it's an anthem, a very big anthem for squirrels that is continuously putting squirrels into play. It does cost 6 for a 1/1, but if you can keep it in play, this guy can get really out of hand and can really make that swing wide strategy work. But it also just continuously pumps out tokens, so the aristocrat's strategy is also viable. All right, next up, we are going to look at Deep Forest Hermit. Deep Forest Hermit is very similar to Deranged Hermit, with the minor problem being that it will eventually vanish away. So Deep Forest Hermit is 3 and 2 green, just like a Deranged Hermit. Has Vanishing 3, which means that it gets 3 time counters, and when the final time counter is removed, you have to sacrifice it. And when it enters the battlefield, you get to create 4 1/1 green squirrel tokens, and it's a Squirrel Anthem. So the one thing about this card that I particularly like, besides the fact that we're creating a lot of squirrel tokens, is actually the fact that it's vanishing, because it will put itself in the graveyard, and we do have some graveyard recursion. So the value of this card actually is, while the vanishing kind of seems like a bad thing, it actually gets some value from the black recursion in the deck. So I'm excited about seeing how this card performs. Next up, we have Ivy Lane Denizen, and I was talking about this before. Whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So we're going to have a lot of green squirrels hitting the table at any given time. So this is going to put some work in as long as it stays in play, which means it's going to be a huge target. It costs 3 and a green, and it is a 2/3 body. And creatures in general are easier to get rid of than most permanents, but at the end of the day, this can still put in some work. And again, I don't know if it's correct, but it might have a loop with that Scurry Oak that I didn't see until just now. So again, very cool. We're just going to get some +1/+1 counters and really put some pressure on the opponents. Next up, we have Drey Keeper. Drey Keeper is 3, a black and a green. It is a 2/2 elf druid. When Drey Keeper enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 green squirrel tokens, and then for 3 and a black, squirrels you control get +1/+0 and gain menace until end turn. So menace means that your creatures cannot be blocked unless they are blocked by 2 or more creatures. And again, when you're swinging wide, that means that you are now potentially swinging in for even more damage. So it keeps up with that idea of making it look like we're going to try and be aggressive, when in reality, we're just going to try and attrition our opponents to death. Then we have Grismald, the Dread Sower. He's got Trample, and at the beginning of your end step, each player creates a 1/1 green plant creature token. So we're going to create a plant token, which, if we have Chatterfang on the table, because we're creating a token, is also going to create a squirrel token. Yes, your opponent is going to get little 1/1 chump blockers, or multiple opponents are. But whenever a token dies, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Grismald the Dread Sower, so we can potentially make this guy very large. And because he is trample, we can swing in, and even with the 1/1 chump blockers, we're still going to deal some damage, even if it's a small amount of damage. Next up, we have Poison Tip Archer. I believe this is the first of the Aristocrat suite here. 2 and a black and a green for a 2/3 body with reach and death touch. Whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So as my tokens are being sacked or blocking or getting blocked, as they are dying, even through board wipes, each of your opponents loses 1 life. Next up in the black cards, we're going to have Underworld Hermit. Yet another hermit that creates green squirrel tokens. This one creates green squirrel tokens equal to my devotion to black. In order for this one to be worth it, you're going to have a devotion to black in the range of 4 or 5. So at least 3 black pips on the table when you play it, because at that point you'll have the 2 black pips that he has. He costs 6, so it's a little bit pricey, but hopefully we can get some good squirrel tokens out of that. And again, with Chatterfang, you're doubling the amount of tokens that are coming out. Next up, we have Nested Shambler. Nested Shambler is one of those where you're getting value instantly because it's a 1 black for a 1/1. When it dies, you create X tapped green squirrel tokens, where X is Nested Shambler's power. So if it dies, you're getting to replace it immediately. But the thing is that in this deck, 1/1 counters are going all over the place, especially with Ivy Lane Denizen. So you could potentially start stacking the 1/1 counters on this and then making it pop for quite a few squirrels. So there's some serious value there. It's better than those types of cards that when they die they create 1 gosh, what is the name of that card? Grim Initiate. When it dies, it creates a 1/1 zombie. This one is better just simply because if it gets more powerful, it is going to create quite a few squirrel tokens. Next up, we have Species Specialist. As it enters the battlefield, you're going to choose a creature type, and then whenever a creature of the chosen type dies, you get to draw a card. So again, we're trying to create the squirrels, and then we're trying to sacrifice the squirrels for value, and this is just going to give you more value on top of that, because when those creatures are being sacrificed, specifically the squirrels, you're also going to get to draw a card. So not only are we going to get the Aristocrat triggers where your opponents are losing life and you're gaining life, but now you're also drawing a card, which is so important to Commander. Next up, we have Viscera Seer. Viscera Seer is a sack outlet. You sacrifice a creature, you scry 1, right? So it's 1 for a 1/1, sack a creature, scry 1. It's not the best in the world, but sometimes that scry is all you need to kind of unlock your deck. Then we have Ruthless Knave. Ruthless Knave is another sack outlet. For 2 and a black, you can sack a creature and create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens that you can tap to sack for any colored mana. This is really important for a lot of things because not only does it create the treasure tokens, which is a really incredible token, but it's creating tokens, which means that with Chatterfang on the table, not only are we going to sacrifice the creature to get 2 treasure tokens, but we're also going to get 2 squirrels. So we're actually only sacrificing 1, and we're going to get the value of 2, right? And it's not quite to the point where it's an infinite because it costs 3 to activate this ability and you only get 2 treasure tokens, but you can definitely generate a huge amount of value from this card alone. And then you can also sacrifice 3 treasure tokens to draw a card, which you don't necessarily need. Again, if you have like a Species Specialist in play, that might not be necessary. But this card is just going to be downright good value. Next up, we have Zulaport Cutthroat, and this is going to start the remaining part of the Aristocrat theme that we have going in here. Zulaport Cutthroat says, whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. We have Nadier's Nightblade. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain life. So again, we're sacking those tokens. We're trying to get some value. We have Blood Artist. Whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's not as good as, say, the Zulaport or the Nadiers, but it's out there to do some work. We have Vindictive Vampire. Whenever another creature you control dies, Vindictive Vampire deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. We have Falkenrath Noble. Flying, whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is just a flying version of the Blood Artist. And then finally, we have Nadir, Agent of Duskanal. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on Nadir, Agent of Duskanal. So it's a very similar ability to Griswold, except that it specifically refers to tokens. And then whenever Nadir leaves the battlefield, create a 1/1 green elf creature token equal to the power of Nadir when he leaves the battlefield. So not only is he going to get bigger, if he dies, he's going to create a whole bunch of elves. If you have Chatterfang in play when those elves are created, then you're actually doubling down on elves and squirrels. And more importantly, because again, we're running black, we have that recursion. So if he's in the graveyard, you can potentially bring him back to the table. So very good card. Not aristocrats, but it's going to create a very annoying creature to deal with. We're going to move into the instants. There's not as many instants in here. There's quite a few sorceries, but let's just jump in. We have Verdant Command. Verdant Command has choose 2. Create 2 1/1 green squirrel tokens. Counter target loyalty ability on a planeswalker. Exile target card from a graveyard. Or target player gains 3 life. So it has a couple really good modes here. Not so keen on the gaining 3 life, but exiling a card in response because this is an instant. And getting that card that your opponent's trying to pull from the graveyard is very good. Countering loyalty abilities. If your opponent is about to pop off on an ultimate, is a great way to stop that from happening. It also can stop, let's say, single target destruction abilities or something like that. If there's just a loyalty ability that just does not need to happen, this helps you get rid of that. But on top of all of that, it creates 2 squirrel tokens for 2. And right, as I mentioned before, with Chatterfang, that's actually going to be 4 tokens. Next up, we have Second Harvest. Second Harvest is going to check for every token that you control and then create a copy of those tokens. So you're just going to double down on every token that you have in play. And once again, with Chatterfang, you're actually going to double that as well. So you're going to put a lot of tokens in play if you have Second Harvest and Chatterfang online. Plum the Forbidden is another sack outlet, but a very, very good sack outlet for this. Let me explain. It costs 1 and a black, and as an additional cost to cast the spell, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When you do, copy the spell for each creature sacrificed this way, and then you draw a card, and you lose a life. Okay, so you're probably not going to end up losing that life, because you will probably likely have at least 1 aristocrat trigger on the table. So every time you're sacking a creature, you're gaining a life. This is just going to negate that. Okay. You get to draw a card, but I think the most important part here, you get to draw a card for every creature you sacrifice, but the most important part here is the part that says, when you do, copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way. This isn't the same as having a kicker cost, where you get to redo the ability of the card for each time you kick it. This one says you get to copy the spell, which means that you're putting another copy of this spell on the stack, which matters for Storm. And the reason that's a big deal is because of Chatterstorm. Chatterstorm has Storm, and it creates squirrel tokens. So you're going to sacrifice squirrel tokens to draw a bunch of cards, which forces you to lose life, but you're going to copy that spell X amount of times. Each one of those copies counts towards Storm, so then you can cast your Chatterstorm for I don't even know how much, replacing literally all the squirrels that you probably lost when you sacrificed them. But again, if you have Chatterfang, you're actually doubling down on that. So Plum the Forbidden is a very good card in here and is probably the best sack outlet here. Then we move into our single target removal. We're going to go with a Krosan Grip here. Has split second, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Cannot be responded to. Then we have Putrefy. Destroy target artifact or creature. That creature cannot be regenerated. Then we have Beast Within. Destroy target permanent. Its controller gets a 3/3 beast. Which, again, if you're using this, you're using it on a big threat. So the 3/3 beast is negligible. And especially in a deck like this where we're trying to get triggers off of tokens and creatures dying, I have no problem tripling up to block it with 3 squirrel tokens, losing all 3 of those squirrel tokens to get 3 Blood Artist triggers or 3 Zulaport Cutthroat triggers. So this is just a really great card in general. Then we're going to move into our sorceries, and there's quite a bit of sorceries in here. You just separate them. There we go. Starting off with the iconic Chatterstorm. Chatterstorm specifically, 1 and a green, create a green squirrel token. It has Storm. So this play right after a Plumb the Forbidden can be downright devastating. But there's a lot of low-cost cards in here. So the later in the game that you have this and that you play it, the more value you're actually going to get off of it. So Chatterstorm just creates squirrels. We then have Acorn Harvest, 3 and a green to create 2 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens, and it has flashback for 1 and a green and pay 3 life. So we're just going to try and get more of those squirrel tokens on the table. We have Chatter of the Squirrel. For 1 green, you put a 1/1 green squirrel creature token into play, and it has flashback for 1 and a green. We have Rampant Growth. For 1 and a green, search your library for a basic land card. Put that card into play tapped, then shuffle your library. 3 visits, search your library for a forest card. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Kodama's Reach and Cultivate, they do the exact same thing. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and 1 into your hand, then shuffle your library. And then the final card in our ramp suite, Sky Shroud Claim. Search your library for up to 2 forest cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Next up, we're going to have our utility sorceries here. Turn Timber Symbiosis lets you look at the top 7 cards of your library, choose a creature from among them, put it onto the battlefield, and if that creature has a converted mana cost of 3 or less, you get to put 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Put the remaining cards on the bottom of your library. I already explained that the +1/+1 counters in here can benefit a ton of different creatures in here. So Turn Timber Symbiosis is a great way to get some of those cheaper cards in play. More importantly, though, you can run into things like the Deranged Hermit, the Undergrowth Hermit, any of the hermits that cost 5 to 6 mana. Any card in here is really going to benefit from this coming into play. More importantly, it is a double-faced card, so if you need a land and you're in a desperate situation, this will get you that land because it is a land. Next up, we have Shamanic Revelation. You're going to draw a card for each creature you control, and then if you have Ferocious, you're going to gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Okay, so depending on where you are in the game when you cast this, it can be just as simple as getting a card for each creature you control, which can be really big in a Squirrel Generation deck. But there is a possibility that there will be quite a few creatures with power 4 or greater, depending on how many +1/+1 counters are in play, depending on how many anthems are in play. So you can actually benefit from both sides of this, which could be really crazy good. Gaining that much life could really put you in a almost unopposed position. Next up, we have Agadeem's Awakening. Return from the graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards with that each have a different converted mana cost of X or less. This is part of the recursion that's available in this deck, and it's just a great way to get some of those targets that you want back in play, back onto the table, doing their job. And again, it's a double-faced card, so worst case scenario, if you're in a bad position, you can simply use this as a land. Then we're going to move into single target removal in the sorcery speed. We have Desert Twister, which destroys target permanent. It costs 6, but again, you're only going to be casting this to get rid of something very problematic. So Desert Twister is very good. We got Casualties of War, another one that costs 6, but it is way too versatile not to use in Golgari. Destroy target. You can choose one or more, so you could choose all of them. Destroy target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or Planeswalker, or Planeswalker. So you can really level out the big problems on the table with just this one spell. Then we're going to move into the board wipes. We have Damnation, destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated. It's just the mono black version of Wrath of God. We have Decree of Pain. Decree of Pain destroys all creatures that can't be regenerated, and then you draw a card for each creature destroyed this way, which is an incredible benefit. But you can also choose to cycle this for 3 and 2 black, and if you do cycle it, all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So what is the benefit for that? Again, my whole point here is a lot of triggers from things like my Falkenrath Noble, my Blood Artist, my Zulaport Cutthroat, so on and so forth. So if I see myself in a position where cycling this card will kill off a ton of my tokens and get a ton of triggers that may end the game, this is a fantastic way to just outright end the game. But then on top of that, if you have the mana, because it costs 8, you can destroy all the creatures in play, which means you're still going to get your triggers, but you're also going to draw cards for each creature destroyed that way. So you're just going to fill your hand with a bunch of new options. Very good card. And then finally, we have Gaze of Granite. And this won out over Toxic Deluge because A, Toxic Deluge is still like a $25 to $30 card. And B, it gives -X/-X based on the life that you pay, which would be great in a deck like this because you're going to gain a lot of life. But it only destroys creatures, whereas Gaze of Granite destroys non-land permanents. And to me, it's really important to be able to get rid of problematic enchantments, artifacts, you name it, on the table, even planeswalkers in this case. Over just getting rid of creatures. So that's our sorceries. Next up, we have artifacts. We're going to look at both the mana rocks and the utility artifacts. Starting with our Chitter Spitter. Chitter Spitter is a sack outlet, and it is also a token generation, and it is also an anthem. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can sacrifice a token. If you do, put an acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. Squirrels you control get +1/+1 for each acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. And then for a green, you can tap it to create a 1/1 green squirrel token. And again, with Chatterfang in play, that doubles up. So just outright a great anthem for squirrels. Next up, we have Coat of Arms. This lends to, if I can't kill you through my triggers from my Zulaport Cutthroats and so on and so forth, then I will have to kill you with tokens, and Coat of Arms just does that job beautifully. Each creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield that shares at least one creature type with it. Your squirrels will just get massive, and there's going to be a point where your opponents just cannot keep up with that value. Next up, we have Door of Destinies. It's another one of those out-of-control anthems. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Whenever you cast a spell of the chosen type, put a charge counter on Door of Destinies. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1 for each counter on Door of Destinies. So it can get kind of out of hand. Not nearly the same way that Coat of Arms is going to go, but it's still a very good card. And then I think this is the last of the utility artifacts. We have Skull Clamp, another sack outlet. Equipped creature gets +1/-1, and whenever equipped creature dies, you draw 2 cards. It equips for 1. It costs 1. In the very early stages of the game, your squirrels are all going to be 1/1s. You might have an anthem here and there, but for the most part, your squirrels are all going to be 1/1s. So you can start hopping this onto your squirrels, killing them, triggering your aristocrat triggers, and then also drawing yourself 2 cards, so you're getting options. So it's the start of the sack engine. Now, later in the game, when we have more of our anthems in play and so on and so forth, this guy's going to be less useful for like instantaneous card draw, but it's going to be really good for putting it on something that you know is going to be a target, so that you get some value from that target being destroyed. Next up, we're going to look at rocks. We got Soul Ring, 1 for 2. We got Arcane Signet, 2 for 1 of any color. that your commander creates. We got Golgari Signet. 2, if you tap 1 and tap it, you get a black and a green. We got Thought Vessel. 2 for 1, but you also have no maximum hand size. And then we have Everflowing Chalice. It has 0, but it has multi-kicker 2. For every time that it was kicked, you're going to put a charge counter on it. And you can tap it to add colorless mana to your mana pool for each charge counter on it. It's not terrible, but it's not also that good. It's just a nice way to get, you pay 6, you get 3 mana. You pay 4, you get 2 mana. You pay 2, you get 1 mana. It's roughly the ranking for rocks these days. Next up, we're going to take a look at enchantments. First up, we have Squirrel Nest. I did at one point in time have Earthcraft in here. And then I realized that with Earthcraft and Squirrel Nest, you could loop infinite squirrels, and I didn't want to put that on my opponents because I felt like that was a little OP. So I did remove it. And keep in mind that I'm purposely dumbing down these commander decks because I don't want them to be unplayable against, basically. Squirrel Nest is an enchant land for 1 and 2 green. You can tap. It gives the land the ability to tap to create a squirrel token. Just downright good value. We got Druid's Call. Whenever enchanted creature is dealt damage to its controller, is going to put that many 1/1 squirrel tokens into play. So basically, you're going to put this on some beefy beater and try and swing in to get damage done to it. Worst case scenario, your opponents look at it as a way for you to create a bunch of squirrels so they just don't block it. So you're still going to get in for some damage. It would be great on Nautier. It would be really great on Griswold. You name it. We got Squirrel Sanctuary. It's an enchantment for 1 green. When it enters the battlefield, you get to put a squirrel token onto the battlefield. But whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you can pay 1, and if you do, return Squirrel Sanctuary to your hand. So you just kind of reoccur it and keep getting squirrel tokens from it. We got Vampiric Rites, 1 black for an enchantment that if you pay 1 and a black, you can sacrifice a creature to gain life and draw a card. So this is another sack outlet that you're looking for to sacrifice your tokens to gain life, draw cards, and then trigger your aristocrat effects. Then we have Binding of the Old Gods. I put this under utility because it is not only a ramp spell, but a single target removal spell, and also it can be potentially a game ender in this deck. Binding of the Old Gods says destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls as its first part of the saga, which is the single target removal. So you get rid of something that is you just don't need on the table. And then for the second part of the saga, you get to search your library for a force card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. The important part here is that it's ramp, but it specifically doesn't target basic lands. You can target any forest. And maybe in late game, you don't necessarily need anything but a basic forest, but it gives you that option. And then finally, the last part of this is creatures you control gain death touch until end of turn. Okay, so that turns your little 1/1 squirrels into very, very deadly tools. And it could potentially be a game winner because you're going to swing in with your squirrels at this point. Your opponents will either have to take a huge amount of damage or they have to block. If they block, they lose a creature, which means that it's going to trigger the Blood Artists and so on and so forth, which is exactly the plan we want to go for. But more importantly, your little 1/1 squirrels are probably going to die too, so there's going to get some triggers right there. It's just going to get downright bad. And because they have Death Touch, it doesn't matter what your opponent uses to block them, whatever they block with is going to die too, so it could potentially wipe out the field. It's just a really great card in this deck. Next up, we have Journey to Eternity. Journey to Eternity is an enchant creature. It says when the enchanted creature dies, return to the battlefield under your control. Then return Journey to Eternity onto the battlefield transformed. It transforms into a land, but the specific thing about this land, and I will pull it off camera so I can pull it out and flip it, is that for 3 a black and a green, you can tap it to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can reoccur some of those really good cards that have gone into your graveyard. You can get more of your sack outlets in play. You can get more of your Zulaport Cutthroat, Blood Artist, whatever in play. You could bring that Vanishing Druid back into play, so on and so forth. There's a lot of really good utility for that in here. And you can also just tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So it's just a really versatile card. You flip that back over to the Journey to Eternity. And then finally, the last enchantment in here is going to be Sylvan Anthem. Sylvan Anthem gives all green creatures you control +1/+1. And whenever a green creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to scry 1. So a great way to make sure that you're getting the cards that you need when you need them. It's an Anthem, so it's really good. But it's strictly better than, I believe it's called Gaia's Anthem, the green version of Glorious Anthem, which gives all of your creatures you control +1/+1 with no other benefit, and actually costs 1 more extra mana. So yes, this one specifically says only my green creatures. Well, my squirrels are green, so that's what's going to be a majority on the field. Next up, we are going to look at the single planeswalker that I put in here. We have Freyalise Llanowar's Fury. This is mostly utility. It is not necessary to the deck, but it is good to have in here for a couple reasons. Let's look at the +2 here. You get to create a 1/1 green elf druid token with tap to add a green mana to your mana pool. So you get to create a Llanowar elf, which helps to ramp. But again, if you have Chatterfang in play, not only are you going to create the 1/1 elf druid token, but you're also going to create a squirrel token. So you benefit from that. Its -2 is destroy target artifact or enchantment. So we got some single target hate on artifacts and enchantments. And then finally, its -6 allows you to draw a card for each green creature you control, which again, in Commander, it is so valuable to be able to draw cards. And so this just gives you another option to be able to draw cards if things don't look good, or if you just need extra cards in your hand. Last thing we're going to look at is mana base, starting with the cards that produce any color that my commander produces, and then followed up by utility, and then finally the color fixers and the basics. So obviously we have our command tower in here. That is going to be in every commander deck. If you're not running command tower, even in your, I guess you don't have to use it in monocolored decks because there's no point, but command tower does not come into play tapped, adds 1 mana of any color to your mana pool of your commander's color identity. It's just downright good for mana fixing. Then we have Path of Ancestry with the same rough ability where it adds 1 mana of any color that you're in your commander's color identity. However, it comes into play tapped. The upside to that is that if you spend the mana to cast a spell that shares a creature type with your commander, so in this case Squirrel, you get to scry. Next up, we have Swarmyard. You can tap it for 1 colorless mana. This is when we hit the utility lands. You can also tap it to regenerate a insect, rat, spider, or squirrel. We're not looking at this to regenerate your squirrel tokens. Obviously, there are quite a few regular just squirrels in there, and they can get single targeted out really easily. They can even get hit by board wipes, and assuming that the board wipes are single target doesn't specifically say that they can't be regenerated, you have this here as an insurance policy to keep some of the better squirrels alive. Next up, we have Grim Backwoods. It can be tapped for a colorless mana, or as, again, a sack outlet, you can tap 2, a green, and a black. Tap the Grim Backwoods and sacrifice a creature to draw a card. It's not the best sack outlet, but it is a sack outlet, so if it's necessary, here it is. Next up, we have Bojuka Bog. You can tap it to add black to your mana pool. Comes into play tapped, but the most important part here is when it enters the battlefield, you exile target player's graveyard. It should be in every deck that has black in it, but it's really good because it keeps that recursion from happening from your opponents. If you know that they have some really good cards in their graveyard, and they're playing a color that allows them to reoccur those cards. Bojuka Bog fixes that problem. Next up, we have Dryad Arbor. Dryad Arbor is a land, it is a creature, it is a forest, it is a dryad. It is in here because it is a forest. You can search it out with cards like Binding of the Old Gods, 3 Visits, so on and so forth, even Skyshroud Claim. It is slightly vulnerable because it is just a 1/1 creature. You cannot tap it the turn that it comes into play for mana because it is a creature, so therefore it has Summoning Sickness. But it's just an interesting card. It's a good target to get out of your deck with your ramp and so on and so forth. It can be a body to block with. It's just an interesting card. Next up, we have Okina, Temple of the Grandfathers. You can tap it to add a green mana to your mana pool, or you can tap a green and it to give target legendary creature +1/+1 until end of turn. So this can target your Chatterfang, this can target your Toski. You can target your Griswold even. It's just a way to get some extra damage in. Next up, we have Pendelhaven. Pendelhaven can be tapped for a green mana, or you can tap it to give target 1/1 creature +1/+2 until end of turn. This is great for early game squirrel tokens, just to make them a little bit bigger. It can help you take out, 2 toughness threats. It gives it 3 toughness itself, so it can live through 2 power blockers, so on and so forth. Next up, we have Mosswart Bridge. This is in here for the hideaway. You can tap it to add green mana, or if you have 10 power or greater amongst creatures in play, right? If creatures you control, so if you have across the board 10 power or greater in creatures, you can tap 1 green and this to play the hideaway card for free. So it could be huge potential value, and it shouldn't be hard to get 10 power worth of squirrels on the table because it's only 10 tokens plus whatever other creatures are on the table. Next up, we have Llanowar Reborn. Enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add a green mana to your mana pool, and then it has the ability to graft. You only get that graft once, but basically you get to put the +1/+1 counter from Llanowar Reborn onto a creature you control. It's not necessarily better than a forest, but it does help to get more +1/+1 counters out there. Next up, we have Sap Seep Forest. 2 big reasons why I like this in here. Despite the fact that it comes into play tapped, it does count as a forest. And then you can tap it, or you can tap a green and it to gain 1 life, which you can only do if you have 2 or more green permanents, which is not going to be hard for this deck. So it's just an interesting card. I got it for the forest. Next up, we have Oren Reef, the Vastwood. Enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it for green, or you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. This is extremely valuable in this deck because we have cards like the Deranged Hermit and the Deep Forest Hermit that create a bunch of 1/1 green squirrel tokens, and that is the MO of the deck, is to create a bunch of 1/1 green squirrel tokens. So as long as you leave the Oren Reef Vastwood and another green mana open after creating X amount of tokens, you can then turn them into a bunch of 2/2s when they were originally just 1/1. So it's just a really valuable card. Moving on, we have now our fixers. We have our bounce land, Golgari Rot Farm, comes into play tapped. When it comes into play, you have to return a land to your hand, but you can tap it for a green and a black. Next up, we have Tainted Wood. You can tap it for colorless, or you can tap it for a black or green, but only if you control a swamp. We have Temple of Malady, comes into play tapped. When it comes into play, you get Scry, and then you can tap it for a green or a black. Necroblossom Snarl enters the battlefield tapped unless you reveal a swamp or forest from your hand, and then you can tap it for a green or a black. Blooming Marsh enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands, then you can tap it for a green or a black. Woodland Cemetery enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest, and then you can tap it for a green or a black. Got Nurturing Peatland. You can tap it, pay a life to add a green or black to your mana pool, or you can tap one and it to sacrifice it to draw a card. Then you got Llanowar Waste. You can tap it for colorless mana, or you can tap it to add a green or a black, and then deal 1 damage to yourself. You got Twilight Mire. You can tap it for a colorless, or you can tap a green or black and it to add either double black, double green, or 1 green and 1 black. Then we have Undergrowth Stadium. Comes into play unless you have 2 or more opponents, and then you can tap it for a green and a black. We've got Overgrown Tomb. Comes into play tapped unless you pay 2 life, and then you can add a green or black by tapping it. And then I believe that's it for non-basic lands. We have Verdant Catacombs. It is a fetch land. You tap it, pay a life, and then sack it to search your library for a swamp or a forest and put it onto the battlefield. And then finally, we have our basic lands. There are 5 basic forests and 5 basic swamps. And that is it. That is all the cards in the deck. So this is Chatterfang, Squirrel General. Again, what I intended for this, what I dreamt for this deck, is for it to look like we're trying to create a whole bunch of tokens and then swing wide, when in reality what we're trying to do is create sack outlets, get the Zulaports and the Blood Artists on the table, and slowly beat your opponents through attrition. When you create a huge amount of tokens, that gives you a lot of chump blockers, so you don't have to worry so much about getting attacked into, since you're not necessarily going to swing wide with them, but you still do have the option as a backup if everything else fails. And plus, you could just be aggressive and try and do a situation where you're kind of doing a combination of both. So there you go. I wanted to look at some runner-ups real quick and talk about why they're not in the deck. There's 3 cards here. We'll start with Fecundity. I didn't put Fecundity in this deck because I ended up... Let's see. It says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, that creature's controller may draw a card. I believe I replaced this with Vampiric Rites. And, okay, so this costs 2 and a green. Vampiric Rites costs 1 black. Vampiric Rites, you pay 1 and a black. You sacrifice a creature. You get to gain a life and draw a card. This, you have to wait for a creature to die, and then you get to draw a card. And more importantly, this actually benefits both players, or any player. So if you're playing a 4-player game, all 4 players are going to benefit from the Fecundity. So I ended up taking it out. It's an honorable mention. It's great for budget, but it's not in the deck because I think it gives too much value to my opponents. Next up, we're going to have Asceticism. Creatures you control can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control, so it gives all your creatures hexproof. And then for 1 and a green, you can regenerate a creature. This is downright good, and I am trying to figure out how to get it into the deck. It costs 3 and 2 greens, so it's 5 to cast, but it's super valuable. And I think in order for me to get this in the deck, I'm going to have to test the deck to see where my dead cards lie, so I can replace the dead cards with something like this, because it is extremely valuable for this deck. And then last but not least, we have Bane of Progress. 4 and 2 green. When it enters the battlefield, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Put a +1/+1 counter on Bane of Progress for each permanent destroyed this way. This one I pulled out for 2 reasons. The first reason being that the direction and speed that Commander is taking these days has made it kind of obsolete to run any more than 3 to 4 board wipes. I think if you catch the Command Zone podcast talking about the new Commander building template, it kind of explains the reason behind that. And we value more single target removal because we don't necessarily need to remove everything from the table to get ourselves into a beneficial position. And since I already have 3 and kind of a half board wipes in the deck, it didn't make sense for me to continue to put more in there. This also affects my board too, so it gets rid of my enchantments and artifacts too, and I don't necessarily want that, especially for a body that isn't a squirrel or an elf or can benefit from really anything that I'm putting into play. So I just ended up taking out because it didn't have enough synergies for the deck. And those were my honorable mentions. So go ahead, if you liked the video, and like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those down below. I love hearing from you guys, but again, let's keep it positive. Any negative comments will just simply be removed. And if you feel the need to support me and you like the content that I've been giving you, please hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do this all in my free time, so any amount of support that I can get will really help me bring more of this content to the table. And yeah, that's it, guys. Until next time, peace.